Hi, everyone. Thank you all for joining. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes. We'll let a few more folks come in. Okay, it looks like the participant number is quite stable, so we'll get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kalea, and I'm a PhD candidate in public policy and administration at the University of Delaware, and also a member of the APPAM Student Activities Committee this year. I want to thank you all for joining us today for our webinar, Continuing the Work, Studying Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Current Moment. In public policy and administration, diversity and equity have long been core values, but the landscape is now more complex. Researchers face new challenges, from uncertain funding to increased scrutiny, affecting research and the safety of those involved. This conversation is vital and timely. Our panel will share insights on navigating challenges at various levels, including innovative funding, managing partnerships, and disseminating research. They will also discuss strategies to preserve the integrity of social equity research. We have a fantastic group of experts with us today, and my colleague Jordy will be introducing our moderator in just a moment. First, thank you all again for being here. We hope this discussion provides valuable insights and sparks new ideas for how we can all continue this essential work.
Hi, everybody. My name is Jordy Coutine. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Oregon and also a member of the APPAM Student Activities Committee. Some logistics: at about 35 past the hour, we're going to transition to a Q&A portion before launching into the final question for our panelists. So if you'd like to participate in that, please put your questions in the chat and we'll read them aloud when we get to that time. I'm also really delighted to introduce our webinar's moderator, Dr. Stephanie Moulton. She's a professor and associate dean for faculty and research at the John Glenn College of Public Affairs at Ohio State University, and her research focus includes housing and consumer finances, policy implementation, management, evaluation. She's also co-editor of the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management and sits on the editorial boards of Public Administration Review and the Journal of Public Administration Research and Theory. And we are super excited to have her as a moderator. Passing it off to you, Stephanie.
Great, thank you. We are really excited for this panel today. I think this is an important and timely topic. My role is to get to introduce the fabulous folks here that are going to be answering some questions for us today on this topic. What's wonderful is that we have a mix of folks at different stages in the career ladder. So we have some that are assistant professors. We have Felipe Blanco, who's an assistant professor at the School of Public Affairs at the University of Colorado, Denver. Then we have two associate professors with us today. We have Sean McCandless, who's an associate professor at the School of Economic, Political, and Policy Sciences at University of Texas, Dallas. And then we have James Wright, who's an associate professor at Arizona State University. And then we have a full professor here with us today who's performed many roles throughout our field, including past president of our association, Maria Concian, who's a professor currently at Georgetown University. So what I'd like to do is ask the first question and then have each panelist introduce themselves a little bit more as you respond to this first question. So you're all invited here because you have research in some way that relates to diversity or equity or inclusion, or you've talked about these topics or written on these topics. So I'm curious how your research has been affected, if at all, by some of these recent policy shifts. And then what are some strategies that you're adopting to kind of continue your research in this current moment? And let's start off. I'm going to go kind of in order of what I see. I see Sean first on my screen, so I'm going to ask Sean to kick us off, and we'll spend a couple of minutes with each person answering the question.
Right. Well, thank you so much. And I just want to thank the team for getting this going. Kalea, Jordy, Leslie, Stephanie, and more at APPAM. So my research does center on social equity, and I treat it as a fundamental principle of public administration. And I work primarily in org theory and HR. And the way I do it is I want to understand how and why organizations function the way that they do, but also how definitions and approaches of fairness impact workplace dynamics like workplace culture, emotional labor, and how all of these in turn shape individuals and how individuals shape organizations. And I've worked in social equity budgeting, and that's most recently what I do, a few other topics. And I'm particularly interested in how we not only socially construct identities, but also how we socially construct the meaning of our ideas, including fairness. Who is involved in defining these terms? And not only how do different governments define these terms, but how administrators define these terms and who's involved in that. And throughout my work, you'll see a big emphasis on procedural fairness, processes, quality, and outcomes. Now, in terms of policy shifts, there's a few I'd like to emphasize. I am discussing this in the context of Texas. For those of you who may not be aware, Texas Senate Bill 17, SB 17, was passed actually the same year that I secured tenure, and also when I got to Texas, and it prohibits DEI offices and mandatory diversity training in state-funded institutions. However, it does allow for academic coursework, student organizations, highlighting work with first-generation, low-income, underserved students, and so forth, so long as they're in compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws. In terms of coursework, faculty, we are able to retain academic freedom, and we can continue to discuss topics related to race, ethnicity, gender, other characteristics within the context of their course. And for our scholarly research, it is not impact creative works by students are not impacted, but with all of these, there are still some implications about lingering questions about what are the protections for academic freedom in this environment, and the extent to which we can weave these concepts into the classroom. For instance, what will happen if someone argues that the issues that we discuss are not how germane to the topics of our courses, whether it's in public administration or literature or STEM and more. There are lingering questions of what happens. There's other instances of speech, perhaps not immediately connected with our on-campus work, but through professional associations. What will be protected, what will not be protected. And we've already seen some examples of this, of individuals having their employment terminated because of this. Now, this goes in line in Texas with SB 18, which grants governing boards sole authority over faculty tenure. It really increases some of the central control over the academy. And there are concerns if SB 18 can now be weaponized against faculty. And then there's also SB 37, which it really shifts a lot of curriculum and faculty governance power to governing boards. An earlier version of this, interestingly enough, intended to ban teaching quote unquote identity politics, quote unquote systemic racism and sexism. And so in this context, the environment is politicized. There's efforts to dismantle DIA frameworks and politicize so many aspects of the service. These are all euphemisms on my part. I'll discuss a little bit about this later, but what I've just had to do in this environment is really emphasizing my international connections with research, also adopting certain strategies within the classroom, especially solutions-based DEIA work, and emphasizing in my own teaching what we can do with the concept, how concepts related to DEIA. If we learn it on Monday night, we can use it on Tuesday morning to improve our job. So that's just a little bit of a snapshot of what I've been going through. Sorry, a lot of detail there.
Great, thanks, Sean. Maria, I'm going to ask you next.
Well, I just want to repeat Sean's thank you to everybody for pulling this together. It's a very timely conversation. So I think my research mostly focuses on families and their intersections with public policies and how changes in family create new challenges for policy and how new policies create challenges and opportunities for family. And I think my kind of progress through this set of issues reflects partly a generational thing. So I think Stephanie was very nice to she started us with a thing about kind of where we are in our trajectory. I think my role here is to provide history and context as the old person. So what I will say is that It's pretty hard to study family and policy without being very attentive to gender, okay, because family roles are so gendered. I would say that if you look at the literature, and this is what I argued in when I was president of APPAM and gave an address on this, that the field really started with not paying very much attention to differences by race and ethnicity and class. It really was kind of a generic, we're going to talk about families in general. And that meant that we mostly centered middle class white families and that set of problems. And we mostly talked about kind of we came up with solutions to the problem that we imagined for the typical family. And that over time, we got a little bit more thoughtful about how those patterns weren't actually generic. There was a great deal of what we call in the academy heterogeneity, and that a given system could be really good for one set of situations, but might actually have pernicious effects if you were part of a community where the family patterns were really different. Okay. And so that was like I would say like a second stage. I would say after that came, and so in the first stage, people just wrote papers about families. The second stage, people wrote papers about families and disaggregated often by race and ethnicity. In the next stage, I think we were really challenged to like, why are you distinguishing by race and ethnicity? Like, what are the assumptions? Why are you like, why are you looking at poverty by race? Like, what are you implying by doing that? So there was really kind of a critical, almost reaction to using especially race and ethnicity as like a variable in regressions or in a way to break up your analysis without really thinking about or speaking directly to the question of, were you controlling for underlying capacity? Were you controlling for history of discrimination and racism? Like, be explicit. Why is that variable there? And now I think we're at a stage where we're being challenged, maybe not just within the academy, but outside, to justify why are you paying attention at all? You know, why are you elevating that variable from a very different critique? But I do think it's helpful to think about this as not like we had one way of doing it and now we're being challenged in that, but rather that there's this evolution within the academy and that was reflective of the social reality. And now we have a different set of challenges that we have to address.
Thanks, Maria. That was great. James, I'd love to hear from you next.
Yeah, I think that's a great segue. Thank you all. I want to echo what my colleague said about organizing the panel. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm in the School of Public Administration and also College of Criminal Justice, right? And so I sit with multiple hats, so you'll understand a little bit of my framing around this. So primarily, I study by organizations, institutions, and public policies, how they impact under-resourced communities, right? I don't say racially minoritized communities, I say under-resourced communities because traditionally we've under-resourced these communities. And primarily looking at the African American experience as a function of my lived experience, growing up in Inglewood, California, and interacting with police in a negative perspective, right? So given that background, given that history, I want to understand, well, why is it that most African Americans, all these structural issues are tied to sort of governmental services, public policies that have historically existed? So given that extent, I primarily looked at it through the lens of like policing the criminal justice system. And so when we think about that, I'm always questioning sort of the epistemology of why we do things, right, in public administration, management, and public policy. And so given my research interests, what we're going through and what we're living through now is fundamental to the work I've always been doing, but it's also a function of like how I've operated in the system from the beginning, right? So as a PhD student, I was told, it's gonna be harder to test these sort of issues. It's not something that's primarily studied in public management. You should be in a criminal justice program. Why are you using this theoretical framework when we've had these theoretical frameworks for so long, right? I'm questioning some of these assumptions. And so when I think about the space that we're living in now, and I think it's just a function of the backlash from like the 2020 movement, right? So it's a function of what happened in 2020. There's a galvanizing of social justice. We have this inclusionary practices that we start to adopt, and then this rhetoric starts to shift, right? And so I think Maria gave a great sort of historical view of what's happening in public policy, and the same thing's happening in public management, right? Now the question is like, why are we doing this if we know we can't get funding for it? And so thinking through sort of the ramifications of that, I think oftentimes we get caught up in these isolated incidences when oftentimes these are the lived experience of people and their realities, and also the function of if you're doing this work, you've always been challenged, right? So I don't know I know a few of my colleagues, I don't know Maria, but I probably assume she's been challenged on the work she's done, right? And so when we think about how we're operating now, we can talk about this later. I think there's ways to continue to do the research that you're doing, while also couching in other larger projects that may not explicitly be talking about the things that you want to explicitly talk about, but you can still get funding to do the work you want to do, right? And so it's thinking about how do you operate in the spaces that exist that have already sort of carved you out, but how do you still get back doors into those spaces?
Great. Thanks so much, James. All right, Felipe, last but not least, would love to have you share your introduction.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be part of this panel with this group of amazing colleagues. As you mentioned, I'm an assistant professor at Colorado University, Denver. But I also want to say that I was an Equity and Inclusion Fellow for APPAM in 2019, if I remember correctly. So don't miss that opportunity if you have the chance to apply for that fellowship. In terms of my research, what I study is issues related to diversity, equity, and representation from a comparative perspective. I was born and raised in Mexico City, and then I moved to the US in 2016 and got exposed to the social construct of race and the implications of racialization processes here in the US and how the way someone looks may have impact in opportunities in life. And obviously for people of color who were born and raised in this country, they knew it from very early stages in their life. That was not my case. That's just a little bit of background about why I'm interested in equity and representation from a comparative perspective. What I use in my work, it's called an ethno-racial approach. So it's the integration of not only the social construct of race and the cultural aspects related to ethnicity, but also phenotypical markers, particularly that of skin color. Currently, I'm still working out of the data that I collected for my dissertation. So I'm employing this data to explore the support or lack thereof for equity-oriented actions and policies in the federal government in Mexico. In terms of the impacts that I or my research have had out of the changes in policies, I really must say that I come and I'm in a somewhat privileged space because of my comparative work, because of my data was collected in 2022. I'm not currently employing any federal grants, and we're going to talk more about that. What I have seen, though, even in the state of Colorado, is this nervousness in the teaching part, especially this self-censorship, and I must say that despite being in a state that is perceived as liberal in general, there are obviously pushback within the state itself, and for those of you that are in states that are, or were, I should say, considered safe, I think we should be paying attention to what's happening in other states. So yeah, again, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much, Felipe. So now I'd like to open up to an important question, I think, is how do we have impact in the real world? And I think for all of us, we came to public affairs, public management, public policy because we care about the real world. And this work in particular is also very important for the real world. So I would love to hear about some strategies in your own research that you take to try to have real world impact. And that could be through partnerships with external organizations, it could be through funding, but what are the things that you're doing to try to have real world impact and those strategies? And how does your work advance social equity in practice, either through the types of insights that you're finding or how you go about conducting your work? How do you think about that in your work? And I'll just, whoever wants to go first, just go ahead and take it away, and we'll go around. I don't want to put somebody on the spot for this one. So somebody jump in and take it away.
I can go. I should say that impact is a big word. I'm still an emerging scholar, so I do hope that my work has some real impact. What I have been trying to be really purposeful and try to is publishing in open access journals. I have a forthcoming publication in the Journal for Social Equity in Public Administration. great outlet. If you were not aware of it, it's a great outlet for social equity-oriented work. Also, I'm trying to publish in other non-academic outlets that may influence public debate. And again, because of the comparative nature in my work, that means publishing in Spanish and in Mexico in particular. So those are two things that I have been trying to do.
That's great. Thanks, Felipe. All right, I'll put someone on the spot. Okay, Maria, I was gonna.
I'll jump in. So I think there's kind of two big strategies that have been helpful to me over the years. One is to partner with folks who are really positioned to have an impact. So in your area, there are probably people, so, my work is often focused on federal policy and the social policy sphere. So there's a whole set of like like somewhat academic institutions, like think tanks, like Brookings or the Urban Institute, that have more connections to policy. And then there are places like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities that is very attuned to like what are the current debates in public policy. So they are not just looking at, is this research high quality or not, but also is it relevant to the current debates? And that kind of segues to what I think is actually the most important thing for having an impact, which is to be connected in the community where you're trying to have an impact. So if you're trying to have an impact on what policymakers do, it turns out that if you give them the answer to the question that you have, it is unlikely to be of interest to them because it is your question. It is not their question. If you spend time with them listening, because many of us spend time with policymakers talking, but if you can find ways to be in a room with policymakers listening to really what they are grappling with at this moment and trying to find elements of those questions that are also thoughtful, thought-provoking to you, then you can answer a question where there's an audience for that answer. And in the instances where I can really feel satisfied that I did work that I think had an impact, I think that is, with maybe one exception, all cases where the question originated with policymakers. Either it was an answer to an RFP that a government organization asked for a thing, or it was a colleague literally in a slow elevator who said, I've been trying to sort this thing out and I can't really figure it out. And I thought, oh, I've got some data, I could address that. And, it never in a million years would have occurred to me to address that topic were it not that a relatively ground level bureaucrat in a state agency told me that she was trying to deal with that issue. So I think just knowing who your audience is and then listening to them.
That's great. Thanks so much, Maria. James or Sean, who wants to go next? Sean, you're on.
I was actually suggesting James go, but that's fine. I'll go. I'll go right now. This is a great question. So I won't be able to discuss funding, but these external partnerships have always been so important. If I could just highlight a couple things that our panelists have mentioned. Felipe mentioned open access resources and also outlets outside of journal. How critically important those venues are, and documenting what's happening. Particularly in those outlets outside of journal, and having them available to anyone who wants to read them. Very important. Maria, I really like your point about partnering for impact, because one of the things we've saw is that there's governments, especially local governments all over, who are still interested in these topics. And something James mentioned earlier is keeping in mind that we have always had some pushback against our work. Now there is even more institutional questioning of the work, such as through the law and the potential weaponization of the law, like SB 18 and 37. So one of the things I think has been important for me is that, again, a lot of my collaborations have been increasingly internationalized, such as speaking at institutions outside of the United States. For instance, I gave a talk in Cairo, Egypt a couple months ago, in the United Kingdom. Going back to the United Kingdom to give another talk. I think publishing on this topic is critically important to document what these impacts on DIA are. But one thing I really want to emphasize when we talk about research, again, speaking just as myself here, some of the strategies we also need to think about in terms of the impact of our research is also thinking about teaching. that very often some of the biggest impacts we have of research is actually through our students. What do they take from our class and bring to work the next day? And I think the more that we emphasize the usefulness of concepts, here's what you can do with this concept, the better off they are, especially equipping students with that equity lens, the power of that to diagnose problems, to articulate solutions, but also to show about how the presence or absence or use or misuse of public administration principles can be diagnosed and they can be meaningfully remedied. And so in all of this, I'd also remember our research has impacts in our teaching and through our students. And sometimes that's where the biggest impact can often be.
Great. Thanks, Sean. All right, James, you're up.
Yeah, I'll be brief because everyone said a lot of amazing things. I'm just going to amplify one thing. So Maria talked about the community impact, and I think for me, it's always I go to the community and say, well, what are the needs, right? And so part of that's driven by the organizations I'm already affiliated with. So if you're affiliated with the organizations, just go and see, well, what are the needs, right? Because most people in the organization don't have PhDs, right? We're in a very privileged space, and we have an opportunity to help them collaborate research and think about the needs. I also want to caution that that's not often rewarded in the industry, in the academy. So you have to be very cognizant of that, right? So balancing that with the responsibilities of research, teaching, and service. I think the only other thing I would also want to amplify is what Sean said about in the classroom. So primarily, I teach master's students and/or PhD students, and most of my master's students are already working professionals, mid-career, so mid-management or upper-level management. So taking a lot of the theories that we're using and applying them in the organizations is also very helpful for them, right? Because a lot of these local agencies really have a thirst for DEI spaces, which is not very cognizant, like saying the right theories that we use in the classroom. And so thinking through how we can help them apply those in their agencies can also be very, very useful.
Can I mention one other thing really quickly, if I may? James, I absolutely love what you just said. And one of the things I found is the students very often can be the ones to bring that up first. They want to talk about it very often. I teach HR and org theory, and that's something I find hope in and I'm encouraged by in this current environment.
It's great. All right. Well, we have time, I think, for just a short question. If anybody has anything they'd like to add about funding, I know there wasn't a lot of, I'm not sure if a lot of us had experience with federal funding or wanted to talk about that, but if anybody wanted to add anything about the moment and how you're thinking about your funding your research or supporting your research. It doesn't even have to be funding, but how do you find support for your research in this moment? Is there anybody that is interested in talking about that? If not, no worries. James, did you want to say?
Yeah, I'll be brief with funding. So I said I'm in the School of Public Administration and the College of Criminal Justice, or the School of Criminal Justice here at ASU. So with funding the way it is now, right, with the cuts to NSF, a lot of federal funding had cuts to DEI, NIJ had cuts to funding for anything related to DEI. There's ways to think through how you can, one, collaborate when you're funding, right? When you're thinking about the grants you're going to go after. A lot of private foundations are now picking up the slack there, right? But there's also more competition. So for the private foundations, that's one aspect where you can think about DEI, specifically thinking about how it can improve the organizational outcomes, right? So everyone cares about organizational outcomes, institutional outcomes. So framing it around that has always been very helpful for me right now with the funding. Also thinking about individuals that are in the STEM area. So for instance, I have a colleague that's in engineering, is looking at the use of drones, and we had a conversation about how drones can be used to deliver goods to indigenous tribes in Arizona, right? So that's thinking about DEI in those spaces as well. So thinking, I would say outside the traditional ways we think about funding, like NSF and like the social sciences, think about ways to collaborate better. And then also thinking about ways to collaborate with folks outside disciplines that you haven't traditionally thought about, who haven't thought about DEI in those spaces where you can actually get funding to do the work that you think is important to you. That's why I've seen been useful so far.
Great, James. Does anybody else want to add anything related to that? And I think we're about ready. I'm going to hand it over to Jordy pretty soon here. So if anybody has any questions from the audience, please start putting those into the chat because I think that'll help Jordy and Kalea with the Q&A section of this that's coming up next. So I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jordy and Kalea now for that section, but I can also ask more questions if people aren't feeling a bit shy about this topic. Happy to chime in with some more, but let's see if we've got some audience members that would like to ask questions.
Hoping someone's furiously typing to get their question to fit.
Yeah, we don't have yet any in the chat, but I do have a question that I can kind of throw out that just came up. Thank you all so much so far for sharing your insights here. I think they've been really generative to think about continuing this work, and that we are experiencing, I think just another evolution in research and in history and time, as Dr. Cancian and Dr. Wright illustrated. And so we named this conversation "Continuing the Work, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion," and explicitly naming diversity, equity, and inclusion rather than the acronym DEI, because of a clear, I think, politicization around that term. And so I'm wondering if there is, if it, and I know Dr. McCandless, you've written on this topic too, around like defining equity in multiple dimensions of procedural fairness and outcomes and those kinds of things. And so I'm wondering in your work as a panel, if that's a question that you might address in terms of kind of illustrating in our writing, and as we're developing our topics around diversity, equity, and inclusion, how you can actually come to a common understanding of those terms, if that question makes sense. Not fully formed, but.
Who wants to take that one on?
And you're included also, Stephanie, too,
Okay, I
because
was
I
gonna
think
say,
it came from
yeah.
a conversation
I mean,
that you and I were having about it. So I know maybe you can get more light to that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that we talked about as we were planning for this session is how important equity has been to public policy and public management as a term, and that we aren't ready to give up that term, as well as diversity and inclusion. All three of those terms have really important meaning in our field. And they don't need to be politicized terms. Even though they've become politicized terms, they don't have to be. And so how do we, particularly in our research, how do we approach these topics and keep them going in our research, and actually the content and substance behind what we mean behind those terms, which I think, Kalei, is what you're getting at, rather than just using them as, hot button things. I'm going to throw this word in a title because it's going to either tick people off or it's going to make people happy. No, we have to be really thoughtful now about why we're using that term. Maria, it's kind of like what you said about, for a while, we were just jumping race in as like control variables in our models. And in some ways, that was, it was bad. Like, and in some ways, we shouldn't have been just putting them in without really thinking about why are we using these variables. And I think both sides could agree on that. I think that's not a political thing to say. I think it's an important thing to acknowledge. And so we have to really think hard about, well, what do we mean by doing that? And I think even more today, we need to think really carefully, well, why am I using this term? And no, I actually do want to talk about equity in this paper. Like, that is actually part of what I'm examining here, because I think it's important to talk about alongside efficiency. For example, I do work on mortgages and housing, and there's a lot of times when we want to think about more than just an efficient market. We actually want to think about disparate impact, and we want to think about what are the outcomes that are being impacted by this. So I'm going to be really intentional and use that term, but I'm going to be intentional about it. And I'm going to, like you said, Kalei, like, really define what I mean in this context, and not just use it as a hot button word to gain, hate or love. But yeah, I don't know if anybody else wants to chime in. Maria, you've unmuted.
I think I just want to raise two related issues. So one is that I think there's really a challenge in this moment of knowing when we want to reframe and when we don't. Right? So there are times when you, at least for, someone who does the kind of work that I do, which can really center issues, say, of equity and diversity, or can center other issues and then have those be kind of underlying. I think there's a question, a strategic question, and I don't think it has an obvious answer. I think it depends on the context, and I want to that's my second point. But there's this question, you don't want to concede in advance. You don't want to give more ground. We don't want to marginalize a set of questions by not identifying them and not talking about them and not labeling them and not seeing connections across things. So it's really important to think carefully about when you want to do it. So as you said, Stephanie, we don't want to just throw race in, but actually for most things that you're looking at across social, programs, there are really important differences by race and ethnicity and often gender. And it's important not to ignore that heterogeneity, because otherwise you're getting the wrong answer. But just being thoughtful about doing it. I think the other thing that's really worth saying, and it kind of picks up on something that I think a number of other people have raised, is that the balance between those two things really varies across people and where you are. So I just want to acknowledge in this moment, I think much more than has often been the case, individual people feel threatened in their situations and their jobs, and that has to do with personal identity, and it has to do with like structural position. So if you're an assistant professor, you can probably be excused for doing some more duck and cover than you might do if you're a tenured professor, or depending on the context that you're in. And so I think it's incumbent on people who have the privilege to be really careful about not conceding in advance. And it's important for people who, because of their structural position or because of their personal identity or any other number of things, aren't well positioned to feel like they can take a different strategy. And both of those things are really important. And yeah. So own where you are on both sides or along the spectrum.
And it looks like we do have a question in the chat. Jordy, do you want to?
Yeah, I'm just going to read it word for word for y'all. I'm a PhD student trying to find funding to continue my research project for a year beyond where I have funding. But at the moment, difficult time figuring out which funding is still available and which might be available in name only and which has actually been shut down. Is there a good way to differentiate between those situations besides just doggedly asking the funding agencies and organizations?
Does anybody want to take that, or I can chime in if? Yeah, I'll give it a time. So one of my roles in my role here as Associate Dean for Research is to help people navigate the funding environment right now. And I would say, yes, while some funding has dried up, not all of it has. Like, I think that there actually is still funding out there. I do think, again, depending on the source, is it a foundation or is it federal funding? It may affect the way that you need to frame the topic. If you're looking for federal funding, there are certain things that they are not funding right now, but there are still certain things that they are funding. And so there can be opportunities. As a doctoral student, I think you want to be careful, definitely talk with your advisor about those things. But for sure, there are still some resources out there. And foundation funding can also be a good resource. And I would say not be afraid to talk to grant officers. So oftentimes picking up the phone, particularly, or sending an email, you'd want to be respectful of what the particular funder says, but often on the website for that funder, they might say something about how they prefer contact. And also talking with maybe some folks in your department or other mentors that have received funding before. And so that you're not just cold calling them, they might be able to help you navigate that. Usually, a lot of times at universities, there's other colleagues that have had funding or somebody else within the university that can really help you navigate that system. But yeah, anybody else want to chime in on the funding question?
I would just add that funding has always been hard, and it really is harder. That is like a reality. And so that doesn't mean that nobody will be funded, but it means that fewer people will be funded. And that means it's incumbent on those of us who are dissertation advisors and department chairs and writing tenure letters in the future and things like that to really reflect on how the situation has changed, and therefore standards and evaluations have to change. And I think it means that many people are going to have to step back and say, like, do I need to collect my own data, or are there existing data that I can use? Or are there other ways that I can get at this question that don't require funding? And so I think you shouldn't get discouraged, but it's also important to understand that the context has changed. So you shouldn't necessarily judge yourself, and the rest of us shouldn't judge our colleagues by standards that reflect a previous reality.
Thanks everyone for their answers. We've got another question in the chat. Kalea, do you want to do this one?
Sure. So Another question from a student. From a public administration research perspective, what is the most effective methodology to identify and dismantle systemic biases?
Looking at
I'm
my
gonna
colleagues, yeah,
pull a
Sean.
Stephanie and popcorn for Sean or James to hop in, or Felipe, please.
I want to mention one thing. One, it's a fantastic question, and I've heard variants of this question all over the world. There are a few ways that work, but one of the things I have to emphasize here is that there is no effective strategy of promoting equity that I'm aware of that does not involve actively reaching out with communities to understand their experiences, to lower barriers for participation, and to foster meaningful decision making for communities within those processes. I'll just give you a couple examples that's interested in transportation equity. One of the things that cities, for instance, that have tried to promote transit equity have had to do is to realize that people who might be most impacted by changes in transit might not be able to go to hearings about the issues, to voice their opinions in certain ways, and so having different approaches to understanding those experiences were necessary, such as having someone at a bus stop at 4 a.m. to ride the bus to find out about those experiences. The active, meaningful incorporation, that voice, understanding I don't think it's possible to improve equity in any way without that being a necessary condition, a major necessary condition. And I've seen this examples from all over the world, but it's just something I just wanted to start with just to get us rolling.
Can I add a couple thoughts on that? Great question. First of all, I would say your research question itself should guide your methodological decisions. That's one. The other thing that I would like to emphasize is, and this is something that I have found particularly useful for my own research, it's history matters, and socio-historical context matters a lot when you're studying equity. So whatever the aspect you're trying to study, I really think having a historical perspective and a socio-political perspective of that specific issue is very helpful, and is gonna be more effective. But again, as Sean mentioned, I'm not aware of a single methodology that can solve this great and very important question.
And that means all are needed, right? Like, I think a deep understanding of context is so critical. And so, yeah, and you get that through mixed methods and really going deep into that context and listening to people. And yeah.
We have one final question in the chat that I'll give voice to. So we've talked a lot, and many of you have mentioned partnering with professionals, organizations, and practitioners. And so this attendee is wondering how we as scholars of equity in the public sector can help these partners to not only do their work, but protect and institutionalize their work so that it becomes less vulnerable to political shifts.
So I'll start because I've worked in different capacities, one with my work and one outside my work. So one with my work, a lot of times I work with police chiefs, right? And so a lot of police chiefs aren't the most conducive to thinking about how structural racism has impacted the way they police, right? And I've been doing this for, I think, like 10 years, right? And so first, political shifts will happen and will impact how agencies do their work, right? We just have to acknowledge that. Second, if we're thinking about strategies, a lot of times these things are mandated by the law, where they have to have some sort of like audits or those sort of things. So that's one way to think about where no matter the political shift, it's still mandated by the law where they have to be engaged with this work. Second, I think it's important for you to establish contacts on the agency before you're going to dive in and do work to build familiarity with them and to build rapport with them. And that takes time, right? So I say this as a not protected, but as an associate professor with tenure, right? So pre-tenure, a lot of that time, it took work to build these sort of partnerships. And so you also have to combine that with work that you know that's going to get out, help you get the tenure, right? And so thinking about how you can have those contacts in those agencies that will outlast the political shifts and will also individuals that will still be there when one person leaves, there's still another contact that you have. So building rapport with those agencies. The third thing is when you're thinking about equity, you know, there's often times when you think about equity where the way that you view equity from a academic lens is different than how these agencies view equity from a practical organizational like outcome, organizational like HR practices. So thinking through how you can have the same working knowledge from when you're thinking that is very important. And then another way to institutionalize it is to make sure that if you're answering a research question, that's good, but you're also giving them something technical they can take back to their organization and use and apply. Because then they want to keep maintaining that relationship.
Anybody else want to tackle that one? And it was so good, James.
But I think also institutionalizing, James, I love that response. Also institutionalizing those very practices in the classroom itself, and and having exercises within the classroom. But here's how you could do this on Tuesday morning to do that. The many things that we teach across programs. I couldn't agree more.
I also think we can sometimes, when we're collaborating with a government agency, for example, a lot of us kind of come in for one-off conversations. You can establish, especially if you're part of a university or a research center or something else, you can establish a regular dialogue. So I'm part of a few regular dialogues where, you know, different people from, say, the Institute for Research on Poverty meet with people from, say, the Department of Children and Families on a regular basis. Or the federal government has a lot of advisory groups that historically have gone across administrations. That's a little bit less the case now, but it has historically been the case that those advisory groups are often called technical advisory groups, have membership that kind of rotates, but there's people that overlap across administrations, and that institutionalizes that process of consultation. And I think we can do that at, you know, more and more important decisions are being made in the local and state level, and creating that does two things. It allows you to build trust and get those great ideas that our policy colleagues have that might not occur to us, so that we can answer questions that they want answered, but also it can create that institutional connection, so that when there's new leadership that might be more or less engaged, it's a lot easier to maintain something that exists. Most people, some people are hostile, but most people aren't hostile, they just are indifferent. So if you have an existing system, they will tolerate it continuing.
Thank you all for these answers, and also for the fantastic questions from the audience and our team. I think we're going to pass it back over to you, Stephanie, for the final question.
Okay, well, this has been a great panel, and I wanted to end on a note where we could leave some hope for the future. So as we think about the future, what is something that gives you hope for the future of social equity research, or research on diversity or inclusion? And what's one piece of advice you might give an emerging scholar who is dedicated to this field and these types of topics? So let's go in reverse order from what I did last time. So I think that means Felipe, you're first.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. I think that what gives me hope is that the good work continues. There's a lot of committed people. This webinar is a perfect example of that. The other instance that I want to mention is the Social Equity and Leadership Conference. That's another important space that we still need to foster and promote. And again, great group of people there fighting the good fight. In terms of advice, again, I'm myself an emerging scholar. The couple things that I would say, though, especially for students and other emerging scholars, try to find a balance between this good work, which is very much needed, but also your obviously mental and physical health. That's very important, and don't forget about that, please. The other thing, just keep being passionate, hopeful. Equity is in this country, for historical reasons, centered around the notion of race, but equity goes beyond race. There's a lot of work that we need to keep doing around people with disabilities, even gender itself. So that there's still a lot of work to do. And I guess lastly, if any of you in this webinar are interested in comparative work, there's also a huge gap in terms of how social equity is understood or not understood at all from a comparative perspective. So those are the things that give me hope. And again, thank you for this space.
Thank you so much, Felipe. That was great. I think that comparative piece is something as well that we need to think about in this moment, in addition to the historical context. So that was excellent. All right, I think, James, you're next.
Yeah. So what gives me hope is the fact that still local and state agencies care about diversity work. And so, and even to some extent, federal agencies still care about diversity work, right? The rhetoric doesn't always actually align with what's going on within the agencies. So that's the first thing. My piece of advice is similar to Felipe, take care of your whole self. And that's important, right? We are academics, we're also individuals, so take care of your whole self and just keep going, right? And be persistent, right? You just don't know how the ebbs and flows of politics will. You don't know how the ebbs and flows of the times will happen. We don't understand what's going to happen. It's extraneous to what's going on to us now, right? But just keep going. And the academy is filled with rejection, but it doesn't mean that you're less than. And also partner with more senior folks to help you.
I love that. I think the theme of partnerships and context is really coming out, and getting to know, be planted in more than yourself is something I'm hearing. So, all right, Maria, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
So I guess I would say two things. One is a lot of folks on this call are engaged in the academic enterprise, and academia is amazingly kind of obscure and self-reflective. And in a lot of times that's a really bad thing, but it also makes it pretty consistent, which a lot of times is a bad thing, but in this context is kind of a good thing. I expect that the journal review process and the tenure review process and kind of the opportunities to do this kind of work at conferences and things like that isn't going to change dramatically. So don't, be thoughtful about where the messages are coming from and whether those messages are coming from the institutions that are really gatekeeping in your life. And sometimes, like with funding, federal funding, that is true. But in other times, the journals are going to send the papers to the same folks, and those folks are going to largely have the same perspective as they would have had 6 months ago. So, there's some advantage to the sometimes insular nature of the academic enterprise. As far as what makes me hopeful in this moment around these issues is what makes me generically hopeful about this moment, which is the power of community. And the importance of kind of understanding who else stands with you and who are the people that might not stand with you, but you can learn from and build connections with. And I think that's just really, really important in this moment. And I think when we're stressed, there is a tendency sometimes to look inward. And so I would say, definitely take care of yourself. And part of taking care of yourself is building connections with other people.
That's excellent. Thanks so much, Maria. All right, Sean.
All right. Well, it's wonderful responses. I have to admit, I am hopeful, and I'm hopeful because of this, what we see right now. Maria, you described it as community, and this is parallel in what Felipe and James, you have said. People are here right now, they want to have discussions on this topic, so don't give up. Its enduring importance to social equity remains a core principle of PA, despite these political challenges. And what I have hope for is because we can do things at multiple levels. If we can't do something on one level, we can do something on another level. We can always do the work on ourselves, with ourselves, cultivate our own self-awareness. but we also have work with local communities. We need to continue to study how important it is to document right now what is happening, our own research. And I mean research, not only that's published in journals, but engaging with everyone and generating knowledge. That's more important than ever. So be engaged with the communities, but also that continuing to publish this both in journals as well as other venues is critically important. I don't know how many of you are on LinkedIn right now, but I've been so impressed with some of the blogs and some of the analyses on LinkedIn. It's like the new academic Twitter in a lot of ways in terms of the discussion, but also really to remember that there's also other venues in terms of application and pedagogy as well. We talk about research, but research and teaching at whether it's in the academy or whether it's in public service agencies, they're both there. They go hand in hand. That to remember these principles can and do make a difference. We do have a profound knowledge about what leads to better functioning organizations, the importance of equity. So we have to continue to use these frameworks, to teach these frameworks about how you learn something about equity on Monday night. I know I've said this for the third time or so. You learn it on Monday night, you can go back Tuesday morning and do something better in your public service agency to make things fairer for all. Never forget that pedagogy aspect, but be context sensitive, but also be intentional and be vigilant. Be vigilant. You know, we can make this work. I am very hopeful, and don't give up.
Man, I love this. I want to keep a recording of this and just play it in the morning. This was great. I mean, I think there's a couple of themes I've heard as we're kind of closing this out. I think you're not alone is something that's really important in this moment, is to know that you're not alone. So I popped actually over into the chat. There's something called Candid Conversations that APPAM has. It's really just a time to come together and chat and talk about something. So if you're enjoying this conversation, but you're like, I'm afraid to say something because this is a big group and it's a bit intimidating, come over to Candid Conversations. We have one next week. It's just an opportunity to get together with other APPAM folks and just kind of talk about whatever on your mind and how you're navigating this moment. So you're not alone. And then the other thing that I'm hearing is, do what makes sense for you. So be true to you, be true to who you are. I think there's a lot of pressure right now, wherever you sit, and whatever political position you have, to conform to whatever is being expected. But you've got to do what's right for you. So for those of us that want to be true to social equity research and want to be true to diversity and inclusion research, that's going to look different. And I think it was Maria who mentioned something like that as well. And it's going to look different depending on maybe where you're at in your career, but it's also just going to look different based on your personality and who you are. And you have a unique gift to be able to bring this to the field, and it doesn't have to look like the next person's gift. So some of us are going to approach it in different ways, but if we're all doing our work in different ways, we're all kind of parts of the body that have different roles to play, and each of those roles is important in this moment. So I think it's important to not feel like you have to hold yourself to the standard that you're seeing of somebody else, as long as you're continuing to be true to yourself and to your own values, and doing it in the way that you're okay doing right now. I think is a really important thing. So I think that kind of closes out the main formal part of the webinar. I don't know if Kalea and Jordy, if you'd like to end with anything, or anything that you'd like to, last thoughts from either of you.
I'll hop in just to say thank you all again so much. And as we promised, an insightful panel with experts on this topic and helpful strategies for moving forward and continuing to do the work. And thank you for highlighting the candid conversations for us too, Stephanie. But I believe